Hi, welcome to ERDC Live. I am your host, Shelley Tingle with the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center's Corporate Communications Office. Today is a special ERDC Live as we join the rest of the country and the world in marking the 20th anniversary of the attacks on New York, Pennsylvania, and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. on September 11th, 2001. Joining us today are two leaders from ERDC who have bridged 40 plus years of vital research and development, including research that saved lives in the Pentagon on 9/11 and saved lives of the men and women serving overseas in years since. Today's discussion will highlight research leading up to 9/11, the research that has occurred since, and how ERDC is poised to continue that crucial research. Today with me, my two guests are Dr. Reed Mosier and Mr. Bart Durst, two friends of mine. And so Dr. Reed Mosier, at the time of the attacks of 9/11, was the technical director of military engineering for the Geotechnical Structures Laboratory. Since after that, he became the lab director of Informational Technology Laboratory before retiring, and is currently the director for the Institute for Systems Engineering Research. Thank you, Dr. Mosier, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And our other guest is Mr. Bart Durst. Mr. Durst started his career well before 9/11 in survivability and camouflage detection and all things related to force protection, and now serves as the director of the Geotechnical Structures Laboratory. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelley.
So I'm going to get started with Dr. Mosier. A lot of people in our audience may not be aware that ERDC's technology was placed in the walls in the Pentagon years prior to 9/11 due to retrofitting, technology that saved lives that day. Dr. Mosier, you were a major part of the team that led that research. What prior experience did ERDC have that helped in the development of those technologies?
Okay. I just want to say I was very fortunate to be with a team of folks that were very dedicated and had done a lot of work over the years. ERDC in West, when it started, has a history of weapons effects. Started in the early 50s with nuclear weapons and simulating blasts for the military side, leading up to protection, even in times of Vietnam and things like that. We used to talk about force protection from the foxhole to fixed facilities. That was the kind of buzzword we have. The terrorist threat protection part of it really started after the bombings of the Marine barracks in Beirut and around 1983. Then 84, there were a couple embassies that were bombed, and that's when we started our terrorist threat protection. We'd had a background in looking at military construction for heavily fortified, but to civil type structures because of our work with civil defense. So we were starting to put that in place, and how could we protect our soldiers when we had to be deployed. And then starting in the early 90s, after the bombing of the first bombing of the Twin Towers, and then there was another bombing of Oklahoma City, which we thought initially it might be a foreign one, but the result was the same, of killing a lot of people and doing a lot of damage. And then we had Khobar Towers in 1996. We had bombings in 1998 of the embassies. So we were very engaged at that time of coming up with ways to protect people, and the primary focus is to protect lives. So we didn't. So the main thing is not to allow a building to collapse and make sure the fascia part of it, windows, things, don't blow in and injure people. So we had been developing technology in that area. When 9/11 occurred, it really was a much eye-opening of how we were potentially a target here in the U.S. and a major target, and how we needed to work with our partners in assessing and protecting, particularly in D.C. and other major cities that path, and putting our technology that we've developed over the years in place and use.
So you mentioned Cobar Towers, and from my knowledge of it, it seemed to be a turning point in how we looked at those type of attacks. Can you tell us a little bit about what was a little bit different about Cobar Towers?
Well, one of the major things, it was a huge attack. Okay, we had 19 servicemen killed, but a number injured. But it was the first time we'd seen a kind of a bombing of this size. Before then, people had, particularly, planners and things, thought the biggest bomb was kind of Oklahoma City side, 4,000 to 5,000 pounds. This was 20,000 pounds. And it took a while for us in the Defense Special Weapons Agency, now DTRA, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, to convince folks this was that size of bomb and we had to protect against it. We actually ended up writing an appendix that, and doing some experiments that helped prove that. And we went, actually it was testimony used by Deputy Secretary White to Congress, sizing the bomb and explaining some of the issues that are associated with it. And that really heightened it. It became what we had to worry about when we deployed our soldiers overseas.
And so you had to kind of be agile. You had to reassess what the new threats are,
Right.
and then change all the calculations and standards.
And a matter of fact, it was such that now you had to be farther away. You had a good greater, much, it was roughly 4 or 5 times bigger than we ever thought could be the bomb. And so distance is your friend if you can do standoff. How do you stop these big trucks? And them camouflaging what the bomb was. They actually had put it in a storage truck to make sure that people didn't get in there and check it, because of the guards and things. So it made a huge change in awareness that we needed to up our abilities.
And so how did the research make the leap from those technologies, the information you learned in Cobar Towers, to the technology used in the Pentagon?
So around that time, we were doing experiments with the Israelis. They had built this all built up, that they built a building over in the desert to allow us to do technology experiments with them. And so we were able to take some of our techniques that we thought might work for protecting from collapse, column reinforcing, and flying in windows, and to do experiments. Those experiments led to what was actually put into the experiment. So we did those experiments, came up with a solution. They had already started working on the Pentagon design for the rehab, and then we actually kind of got involved with the Omaha Protective Design Center to actually update those designs to give the protection that was actually found in the Pentagon on 9/11. And it was a very short turnaround, like 2 years. We totally changed the way that they were going to do that. We moved the buses away so they couldn't get vehicles close to the building. So it was a number of things that were involved in that assessment.
So we learned a lot from Cobar Towers, and we're able to turn that knowledge around and use it for the Pentagon.
It kept us agile and thinking about what those things needed to be as we move forward. So while 9/11 was definitely caught us off guard, but we weren't totally starting from nothing when we started doing protection.
Absolutely. So following the attack, yourself and others evaluate the Pentagon, how the building performed in the attack. Something that you just talked about, how we have already done in the past. So when you arrive on the scene to these situations, what are you looking for?
So typically in a bombing, a vehicle bombing, of course the Pentagon was a little different with the plane, but we want to get a size of what the event was, how big the bomb was. So important to that is the crater. If we can measure the crater, that gives us a lot of information, and we kind of understand what the vehicle is. And then we start looking at the damage, kind of go out in a circle and kind of look at damage to the buildings, broken windows, even to the point of street signs being turned and bent, That will give us a range. That helps us in finding what kind of size bomb it was and what kind of protection will work at these ranges for windows and walls in the building. And so that's important to get there. So at Cobra Towers, we got people there very early. We got them on, actually the day it occurred. I remember actually talking to Colonel Howard, and he was talking to somebody at CENTCOM. We were getting people ready to go. Oklahoma City, actually Stan Woodson, we put him on a plane before we actually had permission to go there yet, because we knew that it was important to be there.
That's right. And so all of those lessons learned, developed into that technology that saved lives.
So we had a good, 10 years before 9/11 that we were kind of preparing and get, to sharpen our capabilities.
That's right. That's amazing. Before I move on, I would like to remind our audience, our viewers, that we want to hear from you. You are also part of this conversation. And so if you have any questions for Dr. Mosier or Mr. Durst, please just put them in the chat and we're going to ask them in a few moments. Mr. Durst, like I said earlier, you began your career here prior to 9/11, and now you lead a group of very talented engineers and scientists at the Geotechnical Structures Laboratory. One of your major focus areas for the Geotechnical Structures Laboratory, GSL, is military engineering with force protection. And so having that experience now and looking back, 20 years ago when you were working there, how did it change? How did 9/11 change what we were doing, our focus, or did it?
Yes. First, immediately after the attack on 9/11 of the different sites, it was a very somber time here for all of the Erdick family and the entire nation. We were in shock that this event happened. It was the modern day Pearl Harbor for this generation, and we were caught by surprise that this series of events on that day could even happen, and the magnitude was tremendous. First and foremost, our thoughts were with all of those who lost their lives on that day, as well as the families of all of those affected by 9/11 events. And then quickly turn to the warfighter, those that would need to respond, to be our on the front of how this nation would respond to that. Our researchers realized that we were entering a different time for warfare. Weapons being used differently than they were designed for, strike tactics that would be different than we imagined, complex types of attacks, and as much as possible catching us by surprise, sometimes in urban settings or in austere environments. So at ERDC, we have multiple programs across these laboratories. That's our competencies, it's our mission. And as Dr. Mosier pointed out, in weapons effects on structures, has been one in existence for decades. But also in areas such as sensor phenomenology of how sensors behave and perform in different environments, and ways that we can optimize the sensor performance to find threats in the environment. Many different aspects of security and protection that were underway when 9/11 occurred. So the program leaders for each of these areas began to quickly respond as we got through the initial days by adapting the approaches in the existing programs to address what we felt would be the likelihood of what's going to come, especially as America began to prepare for its response. We knew that our forces were going to be put in motion, and the operational scenarios were not totally clear to us at the time, but we knew that we had to develop techniques that could be used in austere environments such as Iraq, Afghanistan, the Mideast, the CENTCOM, or Central Command Area of Operations, which is where this threat emerged on 9/11 from that area. Immediately following, many subject matter experts were asked to deploy to the Army, to the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as to other agencies to begin addressing very urgently the protection of critical assets, critical sites, critical structures, critical capabilities of the country. It was very important for an immediate response to occur, and we were called on. Many folks, including myself, were asked to deploy to different parts of the country for our nation's security. And it was a very, I guess, challenging time. The airlines had shut down for several days due to the nature of the events. And I was one, along with many others from ERDC, that were asked to deploy to places by air on those days immediately following. And there was hardly anyone flying. There was hardly anyone in the airports. So each person would very carefully analyze the partners on the flights. And we all got to know each other very quickly, right? As well as in the airports. But importantly, we were driven to go execute a part of the mission to address what could happen after we saw what happened on 9/11 and to mitigate attacks of that nature. So it was very challenging times. We immediately, passionately were driven to go in and respond with adapting our programs to what may come.
So you spoke about how the type of combat that was being implemented was very different, and this posed many challenges. You just talked about that. Can you get a little bit more specific on what type of challenges were these engineers and scientists facing, and what were some of the specific technologies that came out of that?
Yes, absolutely. So once our forces were deployed to engage in Iraq, we had very large troop concentrations in base camps, small cities that were clustered in areas all through the area of operations, compounds that were for the bed down areas, command and control, even the feeding of our troops, logistical nodes for the war on terrorism. And these were very lucrative targets, as well as the convoys that would deploy from those locations to execute the mission in that environment. So we began to undergo attacks from rocket, artillery, and mortar threats, or RAM. Artillery and rockets were a weapon of choice by the insurgency to attack these large concentrations in these compounds. There's so many, at times, so many soldiers and civilians in those locations, it was hard to miss. So we began suffering large casualty rates and fatalities from these types of indirect fire threats into this crowded area. So we immediately responded to that type of threat by building partnerships with the other services and other laboratories of the nation. We had a base camp protection program underway when 9/11 started. And it was quite a coincidence because we had, somewhat a coincidence, I guess, and somewhat not, we had the foresight to see that large clusters like this would certainly be lucrative targets, and we couldn't, they're very high value assets for conducting operations. So we had this program that we began to immediately adapt what we were going to do in the program to this real world situation. With that said, with the partners that we brought together, including industry and academia, we had several universities as well as industry leaders on the team that ERDC led. We very rapidly developed several techniques, structural techniques that could be implemented in an expedient manner in an austere environment to protect against these incoming mortar and rocket threats. Basically overhead type protection as these rounds came in. We built practical solutions that were very effective. Our researchers and these teams worked night and day to validate the performance of these techniques that were actually developed over the course of a few weeks. Very aggressive. And most of us involved in that program will never forget the hard work that went into it, and the fact that we handed these options to the senior general officers, the decision makers at the time, and they rapidly chose to implement many of these options in theater. Over $1 billion of this type of technology were implemented over the course of a couple months. And the casualty and fatality rates immediately went down. And it forced the enemy to begin adapting their strike tactics differently. We'll also add, it was the emergence at that time of the improvised explosive device, IEDs. Now, IEDs have been around for a long time, booby traps and things of that nature, dating way back in time and, over the course of warfare. But it really emerged differently in this scenario because of more advanced energetics, more advanced materials to work with by the enemy. And the strike tactics they were employed in ranged from vehicle bombs, as with Kobar towers and other attacks we'd experienced, to much smaller, man-portable, human-borne IEDs, as well as booby trap type setups along roadsides to attack our convoys. And that's where we developed both sensor technology, techniques to detect these threats in the open, very wide areas and urban areas that may be very complex, a lot of clutter. So you're trying to find a needle in a haystack, so to speak, as well as high performance computing. We had been working in countermine technology for many, many years, developing ways to simulate a sensor's performance and actually see what a sensor would see, and then develop algorithms to extract this needle from the haystack. We adapted it quickly to become detection of IEDs, and the entire ERDC was engaged in developing this computational test bed, which could simulate that geo environment. And it improved the performance of sensors in detecting these threats. It led to developing techniques that were applied real world by our forces in detecting that new emerged threat that was very prevalent after 9/11.
I would say that that's the power of ERDC, is our ability to be agile and our ability to partner and listen to our customers and stakeholders and be agile and give them a product on time and ready to be used, and ultimately saving lives, which was the goal. And so now we're going thinking all of that over the last 20 years. And you talked about how we had already kind of developed this base camp technology even ahead of when we needed it. So how do you foresee the future of this? What new threats or challenges do you see that face the warfighter and actually our homeland?
Yes. As history shows through the years, the threats to our nation adapt and change their strike tactics, change the weapons, advance the weapons being used against the United States and our allies. So with that, the events of 9/11 and the time following is basically in our DNA here in ERDC. It's the very fiber of the research programs around our nation's security and force protection for the warfighter. Our researchers are very driven to try to develop capabilities now that would be applied to the future problems we may face. Though we're away from the insurgency type scenario of warfare, there will always be that now. We will always be facing that kind of problem worldwide on both sides of the globe. So we have learned so much, it's applied now to continuing to address that problem as weapons advance and strike tactics advance. We have a term, complex attack, which just a few days ago in Kabul, as we were beginning to prepare to move out of Afghanistan. There was a complex attack there, and the complexity comes from multiple strikes simultaneously. And that was a very devastating type of attack. We've been addressing complex attack scenarios for many years. So we will continue to face these challenges. We also, as we were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and providing security forces following the more intense combat situations, our potential adversaries on both sides of the globe, again, have concentrated on being able to build technologies that bring near parity to what the United States has available as a superpower. So now we're adapting what we've done and understanding the operational environment to these newly emerged threat challenges. Developing technology now to be prepared for the future. When I mention operational compatibility, it's very important. We might develop a solution that works perfectly, but if the warfighter can't implement it, it's too complicated to construct or employ, then it does no good. So we have to keep that practical sense of what must be made available to the warfighter for a given scenario and not over-engineer the problem. We've known for decades how to defeat very large bombs, very large threats, but you can't apply building a fortress around everything that we must occupy. For one, we can't afford it. For two, we might not have enough time. And for three, we might be in a scenario where we need to move around very quickly. We can't build fortresses around our people and our assets everywhere we go, though we know what it takes to defeat these weapons effects. So we have to bring it down to the level that can be done in an operational environment where you're constrained. And our researchers have learned that, apply that every day here at ERDC. And they're very passionate and driven about making a difference. Our people make a huge difference, and especially when they understand and get the news that they've saved lives. It's a big motivational factor. So I'm very proud of that for all of the ERDC and being able to both find the weapons and threats left of boom, as well as protect people at the time of the attack event.
And that's what we do at ERDC. We make the world safer and better every day.
That's right.
That's part of what we do. So now we are going to go to viewer questions. And let's see, tell us a little bit about and this is for either one of you, tell us a little bit about the op tempo for ERDC research following 9/11. So can you speak to how you had to work around the clock or what exactly took place?
So immediately, so many of us that weren't traveling, we actually saw the event and immediately started making contact to the people we work with in DC and other places. And so initially we were offering our help in trying to figure out what took place and what was essentially what the structure at the Pentagon was still able to withstand as far as people getting into it, things like that, the rescue part of it. And then that was for probably a week or so of really intense time. And then we worked on shortly after that how to build back the Pentagon. What were the kind of changes? Because it was important for our country to respond positively to recovery in that part. So working on that, teams of folks were together at that. So there was a number of those activities that were really for, I would say probably for 6 months to a year, that were really intense of trying to get all those things in place, as well as doing some of our other research. Because we were at the end of, in that time, we were realizing our troops were going to deploy and how we could support them. So it was kind of interesting. I was going to kind of pile on to some of the things that Bart was saying earlier. One of the things we had to do is we had to educate people to what worked and what didn't work, And so that was an interesting test that we had to do that. And the best way to prove it, we had lots of experimental parts of it and things like that we could demonstrate what worked and what didn't work. So we got involved in, there was a group in the Army that was looking at solutions, and we helped get involved in the testing of those solutions so we could demonstrate. You had a lot of contractors coming in saying we could do this, we could do that. Well, they really needed to know what ones would work.
And not just assume
Yeah,
that they knew what they were talking about.
yeah.
Evaluating that to find the best path forward. And so you said that you were on a plane, and so what were you doing, and how did that tempo change for you?
Yes, in the weeks following 9/11, the tempo for most all of ERDC ratcheted up in terms of either deploying based on a prescribed mission that we were assigned to do for other agencies or other components of government, as well as the Army and the Army Corps of Engineers. Many people at ERDC continued on beyond those weeks to deploy, leaving their family and going into areas of operation to perform missions for longer extended periods of time. And I think at the very get-go, many of the ERDC employees, engineers, scientists, technicians, and admins all had in their mind, I want to go help. I want to take what I do here and apply it to this national need, to this problem. So there were many, dozens of individuals around all of the ERDC laboratories who did deploy, some for months and months of time. So that was a tremendous sacrifice for those people to leave their families and go perform a mission abroad. Also in the days earlier, there were a lot of very special missions, things we can't talk about in this particular venue, but were of extreme national importance. And the fact we were called on to provide those solutions is tremendously rewarding to those who went to do that type of work. And it usually led on to more follow-on efforts in developing longer-term solutions for these types of problems we've been facing. Many of the individuals who did those types of deployment went on to become program managers and very large program leaders for the nation. So it really grew a lot of additional efforts in this area. It brought international attention to the researchers on these programs, and really brought us to a world-class capability here at ERDC that's respected by all of our allies. And many of these other nations built similar programs, sister programs. As we shared information with our allies, they saw very quickly that partnerships were creating a big bang for the dollar, for the mark, or for the British pound, for example. They wouldn't have to redo what we had already done. They could move into other excursions and we could work together sharing that information. So it expanded the partnerships and relationships. It also did the same with our universities here in the United States and industry. So great partnerships emerged with a sense of urgency, not just to research to produce papers, but research to produce deliverable products to the user quickly, that could be in an affordable manner, right? Addressing these types of real world problems.
And those partnerships are always key in the knowledge sharing, so we're not being redundant, or to share that knowledge with our allies in academia and bring everyone into the table to have the solution. All right, let's see what other questions we have. It says, Jason asked, among the research that was conducted, what do you consider to be the ones that proved to be most successful?
Yeah, so I'll say a little bit. I'll have to say the research that was in the Pentagon that we did earlier for that had a significant payoff. The whole Pentagon wasn't retrofitted, but where it was at Wedge 1, we have pictures of offices that were in that wedge that almost looked undamaged because the windows didn't break, the fire didn't get in, and a one hundreds of yards away did get totally burned out and blown out. And the reinforcing part of it helped the building stand up for keep from collapsing for about 45 minutes, allowed people to leave. So that was kind of an extreme example of the proof that this kind of research worked really well. And the refinements that we've done since then with the backing materials and that part of it, the window protection, has really paid off. And I would say, and then Bart can talk probably more about this, is the after that, the protection that we put at base camps. We know that has worked. We saw as they were deploying it. I mean, literally, we were running experiments at Fort Bliss, calling over at night to tell them what worked and didn't work and what they were going to order for the materials to be built, and that being put in place and working. And we could see a drastic drop off in people's injuries and deaths because of that from rocket mortars. That was, hugely satisfying in that your work is actually being used and people are benefiting from that. So I think that overhead cover, the solution that we came up for that, I think was one of the big payoffs that we have.
I agree. I think that just saving lives, and you could see those casualty and deaths just drop after that. It was just incredible. Jeb has the following comment and question. September 11th changed our society forever. What role does ERDC play in adapting advanced threat detection and protection technologies from military employment to civilian applications? So I'll let you answer that.
Yes. Just because we've developed a technique or a solution, a technology for the warfighter, there's a lot of steps to make it adaptable to protect and be used here in the United States. So additional work to package it in a way that can transfer to a different user set that's in the public eye is challenging. So after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security was established. We didn't have that before. So I'm showing my age, obviously, but I remember a time when you went on a flight and there was no checkpoints, hardly. They might look through a lady's purse and ask you to take your wallet out and hand it back over. There were metal detectors, but then later on, after 9/11, the security advanced to a lot more complex type of process, incorporating many different technologies. I can't say in this venue details on specific ones, but yes, we've very much been a part of providing technology solutions to the Department of Homeland Security, adapting what we've developed for the warfighter to apply to the nation in its homeland protection and security. Some of the programs we started after 9/11 have now advanced to become the world standard. A good example for that is in our lead in tunnel detection, which applies many different sensors and technologies to protect or detect subterranean threats. The bad guys typically are going to go underground very quickly, literally underground, to operate as well as to hide what they're doing. At first, our base camps were threatened by tunneling into the perimeter, under the perimeters, and we developed suites of capabilities. We've been doing tunnel detection for many decades, but the ability to have it reliable, to find that needle in a haystack in an area you can't see is very challenging technically, a lot of technical barriers. And that's a great example because now our capabilities are the world standard on how to find subterranean threats. And now these technologies from ERDC are deployed at our nation's southwest border for the security of our country to detect threats coming into the country from tunnels. And those same technologies might be applied in a different way to detect person-borne weapons at an airport or some high concentration area of people outside of airports. So a lot of work that's gone on for that and continues to this day. And ERDC stands as a world leader in these areas.
That's amazing.
Yeah, one other one that people don't realize that we had a major impact on how bridges are protected in this country, which was something that we got involved in because now they became, after 9/11, they became a potential target, and a lot of them were very vulnerable. So we worked with the Highway Department, DOT, to come up with ways to protect bridges that are already built, to go out and do assessments. We helped develop a course so they could train bridge engineers. So all of this was going on during that time too, and it had a major impact on how we do infrastructure in this country.
And it's amazing that all that was going on all at the
Oh,
same
yeah,
all at the same
all these
time.
balls were, bouncing and trying to support it.
So Kari has a following question for Dr. Mosier. How big of a role did computer modeling and simulation play in this research before and after 9/11?
So a huge role. Okay. So we generally don't do experiments unless we do calculations to support them. And we want to be able, and I use the word experiments because we're trying to understand the phenomena. They're just not a test. They're an experiment. And so our numerical modeling really plays a big role. So starting with Khobar Towers, we were able to help prove the size of the bomb, the damage, and it was to a large extent because of our numerical modeling. At the time, we actually kicked people off the cray and spent a week doing calculations to help support that, and working day and night to do that so that we could provide that to Congress and they could understand what was going on. It's also taking that information and putting it in terms that are explainable. But how we rebuilt the Pentagon had a lot to do with our numerical modeling, the set-off distances, the things that would be upgraded even greater than what they were initially started. And we relied heavily on our numerical modeling. It's a key, if you want to look at I look at research as a stool, a three-legged stool. You got theoretical, you got the experimental part, and you have the numerical part. Those are the three legs of doing research.
And that's when, again, the power of ERDC, of
Uh-huh.
having not just the physical, not just the experiment, but also the numerical.
Yeah, there aren't many places that have their own cray located here and the ability to do it, and we have a long history of using it. We were one of the heaviest users of supercomputing before we actually got our supercomputer. So.
That's fascinating. So I'm going to turn the next question over to Mr. Durst. What role did reach-back engineering play in supporting the war effort, and explain how it has grown in supporting military and civil works projects today?
Wow, I don't know where to begin on that one. ERDC developed reach-back capability for forces deployed in very austere environments to be able to reach back or call back in to subject matter experts to help solve problems that they might not be totally equipped to resolve themselves on the ground. This started as teleengineering, where the technology allowed the communications to occur real time. And during these events following 9/11, we were getting hundreds of what we would term requests. We term them requests for information, or an RFI. And they ranged from one extreme to the other. Sometimes fairly straightforward and simple, like, why are you asking me this? To some problems that were very complicated. So it played a huge role in being able to provide a very rapid response to engineering challenges that our forces were facing on the ground. An example would be a convoy approaching a bridge, and they've got a lot of heavy equipment, heavy battle tanks and other high value assets, but the question would pop up immediately, can that bridge handle this convoy? And sometimes it was like on the ragged edge of being capable. So sometimes those would be RFIs coming in, request, here's what we know about the bridge, here's some photos. And our bridge experts would then help assess the load classification of that bridge, often in the middle of nowhere. And that's just one of many examples. Airfields and pavements is another. We've got this airfield, it's in rough shape, but can we launch these aircraft, or can we land these aircraft here? What do we need to do to upgrade that type of facility? There were environmental challenges. We're in this industrial area that we're now occupying. What might be here? Should we move, right? So a wide variety of kinds of problems being addressed by Reach Back. And to this very day, Reach Back continues and has advanced even further. It's now applied to natural disasters such as hurricanes, earthquakes, globally. Tsunami, for example, we had Reach Back being applied. So on the civil sector side, it's now front and center, just like the combat situation the warfighter faces. And we used and helped develop for the nation some of the more advanced means of transferring data, communicating at the proper security level, so that the recipient of the information is getting the best available data to work with and providing a quick response. That's super valuable to the end user. It makes them much more at ease in pushing forward to execute their mission. For the researchers here in ERDC, it also gives us great insight on what the real world challenges are on the ground. What is the situation we're trying to improve? And exactly how are our hands tied in being able to fix those problems? That is super valuable to the researchers here at ERDC. Gives a great sense of perspective. It helps resolve what exactly am out to try to fix for the warfighter. And there's no better tool for getting that than talking directly with those users on the other end.
Yeah, but talking to the boots on the ground and being agile and maybe reprioritizing or looking at some of our research a little bit differently to come up with these solutions.
Yeah, actually, during that time, we have also really enhanced our technology that we deploy, getting it smaller and smaller, making it better and better. It was so good that often it was used as a communication tool because it was so reliable to people out in the warfighter out in front. We actually had a general officer testify in front of Congress across Teller Engineering because it was the best tool available for them to do that testimony.
And that wasn't actually what it started out
No, that wasn't
as.
what it started out, but just really good capability that
Right.
continually improved.
That's amazing. And so, last question: how did the I'm going to ask this to both of you because I like this question. One of our audience members says, how did the events of 9/11 galvanize ERDC, which was relatively new at the time? So for those of you that don't know, ERDC stood up around 1998, 1999. And so we were young. We were a young organization. And so how do you think, and I'll start with Dr. Mosier because you were here longer. So how do you think that changed our culture?
Yeah, so we were in the midst of organizing GSL, taking the structures lab and GSL, moving them together, and nothing like a real stressful situation to galvanize a team of folks together to work together. If they're the right people, which they were, to work together and make things happen. We really came together across the laboratory. There's no egos involved, none of that. It was solve the problem, help the people. And so some of the examples after 9/11, So we had got telephone calls from people that we'd worked in the Pentagon that were in that wedge. I remember particularly we had worked with the folks on protection-related activities, and there was a colonel, an Army colonel, who had been involved in that, and he, years before, and he had been in the Pentagon at 9/11. He was in that first wedge, and he called us and he actually said, "Hey, what you guys did was what saved my life." And we had a number of things like that. If you remember, shortly after that, we had 60 Minutes too. Scott Paley came and did a day with us in Vicksburg. We did some experiments, showed him some things, went through our technology, what was, we put in the Pentagon. After that, we got a lot of inquiries. So continuing along that line, hey, what you all have done to save lives was, very important. They interviewed several of those people for that show. And we got a lot of feedback from other people that we've worked with that were aware of what we're doing, the great support that we had done, and to keep this up and the importance of what we had done. Really, I think, helped really make our team, GSL, come together a lot quicker than we would have under normal circumstances.
I agree. So, in your perspective, how do you think?
Yes, I couldn't agree with Reed more. It really galvanizes an organization, and especially has galvanized ERDC by saving lives, where our technologies have been applied, and we got direct evidence that it has saved hundreds of lives. It's a very motivating factor. It makes our researchers and program leaders very passionate about what they do. I remember one of my most rewarding times was when the overhead cover to protect against rocket and mortar attacks in the base camps was deployed. We were constantly in contact with the leaders in theater, the ones who were living there, operating there. And we were meeting with our British partners one day, Reed and I and Pam Kennebrew, several other team leaders, program leaders. We're on a quick mission there in the partnership with the UK. We were on the train to head towards the Ministry of Defense. We stopped at a train stand and we got a phone call from Iraq that says, "Hey, just letting you know, we just got finished implementing the protection that you had developed, and we just got attacked and at a dining facility that was full of soldiers, hundreds. It was a direct hit attack, and the protection worked perfectly well. There were no casualties, no injuries, no fatalities in this very highly occupied facility. And it worked so well that the dining facility continued to feed the troops after the attack. They didn't stop. And we hung up the phone and we're just totally amazed, jubilant on getting that type of feedback right after it happened. And it was on the news a few days later, but there's nothing more rewarding than getting a firsthand account that so many lives were saved from such an event. And those technologies are still in use today, not just by the Army and our military, but also non-Department of Defense users. It is now the world standard. So very proud of that. It's a very galvanizing point for the whole workforce here. Many of the folks who are on our workforce now were not around at 9/11. The younger generation is learning from the older generation of what it means to actually take your technology you've researched and developed and get it in the hands of the user. Get it fielded. Otherwise, it stays on the shelf. So we're very driven to get that hard work into the hands of the user. Otherwise, it's not going to do any good.
That's right. And so I'm going to piggyback off of what you said. We're going to wrap this up. But one of the things that I do want to talk about that kind of triggered something when you said that of transitioning these technologies is if there are people in our LinkedIn audience who are like, hey, I have some technology. How do I partner with a Bart Durst? And so we actually have an answer for that. So we have ERDC Works, and you recently stood up a new BOTA with ERDC Works that we accept white papers. And so if you have any questions about that, you can go to, you can just Google ERDC Works, ERDC, and then WERX. And we love, like we said, the power of ERDC is partnerships and working together and being agile. And so if you're part of our LinkedIn audience and you're like, wow, that is something that I'm involved in, how do I partner with them? That's a good way to start. In addition, if you've listened to these gentlemen and think, oh my goodness, I'm at school, I'm majoring in civil engineering or maybe mechanical engineering or computational engineering, and what y'all do, I want to do that. I want to save lives. I want my work to be of value. You can always, we have lots of positions available, and you can always send any inquiries to erdicinfo at usace.army.mil. And we're going to continue this conversation past today. So we have lots of things this week ready for our viewers. We have videos that both of y'all have been involved in. We have a podcast on powerofERDC.org, powerofERDCpodcast.org, talking about military engineering. And we have lots of articles, vignettes that you're going to see throughout the week. So be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and across all of our social media platforms to look at these products. And again, we're going to leverage that reach back. Our reach back program actually utilizes ERDC info at usace.army.mil. That is part of the Red Eye system so that we collect these RFIs. So if you have any questions, send it to us and we will respond back. Thank you so much for joining ERDC Live today.